Welcome. The following presentation was recorded at the annual Best Practices for Pollinators Summit hosted by Pollinator Friendly Alliance and the Xerces Society. Please consider participating in the annual summit next year. You can find more about the summit at pollinatorfriendly.org/summit.
Excited to be here. I'm going to be talking about planning, planting, and managing prairie research and on-farm experience with the emphasis really on planting. And I've included two co-presenters here who are silent presenters at the moment. Justin Meissen is the Research and Restoration Program Manager, be talking a lot about his research, and Andy Olson runs the Prairie on Farms program, and he works extensively with farmers and landowners. And so they'll be joining me during Q&A to help catch any balls that I miss and correct things with their specific experiences. Couldn't do this without the whole team, however. And this is us at the Tallgrass Prairie Center. We're part of the University of Northern Iowa. We've been around officially since 1999, but with roots going back to 1973 when the first prairie planting on campus took place, so 50 years ago. This is our small but mighty team that includes students and Green Iowa AmeriCorps folks. So where we are is in the heart of the Tallgrass Prairie region, and University of Northern Iowa is not an ag school. We're the former State Teachers College, so that's kind of our tradition. The upper Midwest context is maybe quite a bit different from where some of our listeners are from and understand. So I want to talk a little bit about that context, and why we do things our way tends to revolve a lot around that. So as you might know, this is also the heart of the Corn Belt. It's rain-fed agriculture. It's over 25 million acres just in our state in corn and soybeans, and very high land values that are always going up. Our remnants are very, very small. This one is a large one at 20 acres, and we have less than 1/10 of 1% of our original prairie left. That's 1/1000th of the original prairie left in the state. The remnants are too small to collect significant amounts of seed. And the amount of remnant plants in the landscape with populations that are viable, that can reseed themselves, is very, very limited to just a few really tough species, including common milkweed, by the way. But most species have to be reseeded from commercial seed sources because there just isn't enough seed otherwise to do it, unless you're talking about very small handfuls of seed in very small areas. And so that's led to really a system that's very dependent on commercial native seed providers. This just gives you a sense of the landscape near where I live, and also helps you to understand the importance of roadsides in restoration, because 60% of all of our public land is on a roadside, in a road ditch, mostly the county road ditches, those gravel roads, farm to market roads. And so I know that's a little odd, but that's the way it is here. And so a lot of our constituents are at the county engineer's office where they're managing roadsides. Another major constituent is the farmers that are planting conservation plantings, like Conservation Reserve Program, on their land and getting a cost share for the amount of money they spend, and then a rental payment every year. Those are 10-year contracts. But those are the types of large scale restoration work that we can do here in the absence of other opportunities. I think that just shows the percentage of public land, with roadsides being the vast majority after state and county, before all state and county and federal public lands combined. So an overview of my talk, and this is just a little view of part of the UNI campus. Um, First, a little bit about the Tallgrass Prairie Center experience, the type of things that we do that have helped us to learn about establishment of pollinator habitat. And then three kind of guiding ideas that I think, even though your situation may be very different in terms of climate, soils, political and economic context, drivers for pollinator habitat establishment, hopefully these three guiding ideas will be similar or consistent across all this. And there are implications, at least for us and our experience and experiments. So briefly, this is the cornerstone. The Iowa Roadside Management Program is a cornerstone of our center. It was established in 1988 with legislation that made it in the public interest to manage our roadsides in a diverse ecological manner for diverse purposes. So what this has meant in practice is that counties can elect to adopt a roadside plan and hire a roadside manager. They use diverse native vegetation, not just, brome and pasture grasses in the roadside ditches. They spot spray more than they blanket spray. They are more judicious about mowing. And they're using a combination of practices that are an attempt to manage the weeds and also provide more benefits than just the benefit of safety and visibility that we expect along roadsides. So this program was established by the legislature. We put on an annual conference for roadside managers. We obtain a federal grant to purchase and distribute native seed to all of those counties that participate. It amounts to about 1,100 acres a year of diverse native seed mixes to those county programs for the last 23 years. And then the counties are eligible for various equipment grants and things they need. Specialized equipment is the kind of thing you can see here to manage, plan and manage those prairies or those roadsides appropriately. And this is the counties that are actually participating in green and the number of years they have gotten seed from us through this program. We don't grow that seed, we buy it with a federal grant. So back in 1988, when this legislation was launched, all of the seed that was available for the roadsides came from Kansas and Oklahoma, and they were cultivars of the big native grasses. If you wanted a wildflower like prairie blazing star, you needed to order it from the Netherlands because that's the only place you could find seed commercially. So we started a program in 1992 to collect seeds from remnants, diverse amount of seed from lots of different remnant prairies across the state in 3 latitudinal zones, and then grow it out in the greenhouse, create production plots in the field, and then harvest and store that seed until a native seed company decided they wanted to grow it. And then we would sit by the phone and wait for them to call and release a small amount of that seed for them so that they could get their production plot started with Iowa source seed that was genetically diverse. And this has been a way of protecting and preserving what little biological genetic diversity we have left in the state. So over 33 years, we've worked with over 100 species. We've released 89 species to growers and several ecotypes, sometimes 2 or even 3 ecotypes, north, central, and south. And we've expanded the functional group diversity that's available on the market to include not just grasses and legumes and a few Asteraceae, but plants that are woody or plants that are sedges. We introduced a whole bunch of sedges a few years ago. So we're trying to increase the amount of functional diversity that's available in the native seed market. Irvine Prairie is another program that you'll be hearing about here and there. This is a generous gift to the UNI Foundation from a farmer of almost 300 acres. And the resources to slowly restore it back to prairie using high quality methods that we're learning over time. We use a lot of seeds. We use some plugs that we produce from hyperlocal sources. a lot of monitoring and adaptive management, and the ability to try things out gradually over time and apply the lessons we've learned from experiments. The Prairie on Farms program was launched in 2015, partly in response to a unique program by Iowa State University, where they started establishing strips of prairie on the contour within farm fields to reduce soil erosion. And we thought that was a terrific idea, and they needed us because prairie is not easy, as we learned with helping roadside managers. It's a great idea, it can work wonderfully, but there's a lot of things that need to go right. And so we jumped in and began collaborating with them and establishing demonstration sites on farms with cooperating farmers and landowners, helping them with the establishment, doing field days to share with everyone what we were doing, what was working, what wasn't working. A lot of individualized technical assistance and answering farmer-led questions like the depiction on the bottom left. What happens when those prairie roots go into my tile line? That's the subsurface drainage that's so important for high yields in Iowa. And so we bought a camera and we snake it down into those drainage tiles and look and see if any prairie roots are getting into their tile. And the answer is they're not. It makes riveting video footage, and the 90-minute feature film is coming out soon. And other tools like just a simple list of native seed and surface providers that's updated every year. And that's been incredibly appreciated. People really need that kind of thing. And so we're trying to provide those types of services. And then finally, our research and restoration program, which seeks to support our recommendations with a good foundation of scientific knowledge. And so that means applied research that's focused on testing practices that are going on right now using similar or the same equipment, using the same types of seed mixes, and using the same seeding rates, paying a lot of attention to cost effectiveness of various practices. You know, how many plants of a given species can we get per dollar that's spent? And that becomes very important when you're talking about larger scale endeavors and policy making. So to synthesize what we're learning and keep it general enough to be of use to you, such a wide audience, I tried to get to the basics of what we're dealing with. 3 guiding principles that have widespread consequences for us, and maybe they'll also be helpful for you where you are, but keep in mind we're in northern Iowa. We get 36 inches of rainfall. We have deep black prairie soils, so results may vary. So our guiding ideas. Number 1, our perspective is that community is more important than pollinator habitat. The second guiding idea is that native seeds are tiny. And they're vulnerable little babies with no parental care. And under the best circumstances, most of them will still die. So that's a big deal. And finally, that native prairie seeds are also wildly diverse in their requirements, but they're all planted together just the way we would plant corn. And so planted together at the same time. So that leads to some conflicts and some trade-offs. So let me get started with the first and maybe most controversial opinion here, or perspective, and that is that we focus too much on pollinator habitat and not enough on plant community resilience and functionality. And of course, all of us love these pollinators and the beautiful plants that they use and that they serve. And if some are good, more are better, right? Let's more. Let's just get as many pollinator plants in here as possible. We sort of contest that idea and like to think about it in a little bit broader terms, and I'm sure many of you do as well. If we think about it this way, here's this football team, UNI Panthers, go Panthers. They only need 11 players, right? That's all that can be on the field at any one time. Um, but of course, it's a much, much larger group here. So why? Well, we've got offense, we've got defense, we have special teams, we have replacements in case somebody gets a concussion or snaps an ankle. So we might need different people with different skill sets for different types of strategies, different opponents. And plant communities have got a lot of these different things going on as well. Um, different plants that are best adapted to different situations. Not that plant communities are somehow acting as organisms, they're not. But um, when we look at the diversity in a remnant prairie, which is a fantastic place for all kinds of pollinators and especially rare ones, there's a lot of resiliency due to redundancy. We want a diverse, resilient plant community, not pollinator palooza. That the goal is for these plant communities to persist over time, to be resilient, to provide continual pollinator resources across the growing season, and to not be too vulnerable to weed invasion, and to please their human owners and neighbors, because in our landscape anyway, if human beings don't like it, it will go away. So drilling down into the details for a moment, if you'll pardon the visual pun, we did some experiments. We have 2 field experiments in northern Iowa, one initiated in 2015 at the ISU Northeast Iowa Extension Research Station, and one on our UNI property next to the Tallgrass Prairie Center. And I'll be talking about this in a couple different ways, but for right now, let's focus on the aspect of the experiment that's related to seed mix design. That's highlighted in yellow. We planted a pollinator mix that is a grass to forb ratio of 1 to 3, so 10 seeds of grasses and 30 seeds of forbs, about 78 species total, I believe, in a square foot, 40 seeds per square foot. A balanced mix that's half grasses and half forbs, and a economy mix of 3 to 1, mostly grasses, a few forbs. And then that was also crossed with some mowing and some planting season stuff. But these 2 sites were treated the same in every other way. And this is what it looked like in year 1. The blue and yellow and green squares show you the different seed mixes. And so it's a replicated randomized design, the kind that warms the heart of research scientists like me, and is quite rare to be able to do this kind of thing. And here's what it looks like a couple of years later. So you can see the treatments really show up even in these tiny plots. So when you plant a grass-dominated mixture on the left-hand column, you get great erosion control. You get great weed resistance, because all of that, there's no bare ground. Every last bit of that ground is covered. You can run a fire through it very easily because there's plenty of fuel, and it's low cost, but it doesn't provide pollinator resources. Clear over on the right-hand side, if you plant a forb-dominated pollinator planting, which was very common across Iowa, there were over 230,000 acres of pollinator CRP that were planted between 2016 and 2018 in Iowa. It's fantastically popular, and it was mostly forbs and a few grasses. You get pollinator resources. It is pollinator palooza, but you don't get the other functions that are needed in that type of environment. You don't get good weed erosion control. You don't get weed resistance because there's so many gaps at the ground level. You don't have that thick canopy. It doesn't carry a fire very well, and it's not very low cost, very, very high cost. But in the center, if you try to balance those different functions, and in the case of the grasses, I need to say that we diversified the graminoid component to include sedges and cool season grasses, as well as the kind of the big five tallgrass prairie species that are so common. When you do that, you get a nice balance. Yes, you don't get as much pollinator resources, floral resources, but you do get a lot, and you also get these other functions. So our experience tells us that you need a good working plant community to do more than one thing well. And we think it's going to last longer and provide more benefits over time. Now, of course, at the small garden scale, you can focus on the flowers, but at the large scales, this seems to be important. And we did a survey of almost 50 sites that were this pollinator CRP that I mentioned earlier. Was trained a lot of students, went out over 3 years, sampled sites that were 3 years old. And it was a little discouraging. Less than half of the plant stems at those sites were actually planted. The rest were weeds or things that had come in on their own. Landowners ask us a lot about weed control, specifically Canada thistle, and they weren't, for a variety of reasons, not just the seed mix design. They could have been better, and we feel like there's an opportunity there to improve on that program and make it even better next time it comes around. So the second idea is that native seeds and seedlings are tiny, and most of them will die. Very, very tiny. They're quite vulnerable. These are some photos taken by Justin Meissen, who's also an amateur photographer, as well as our research and restoration program. Many species of wildflower seed in the Tallgrass Prairie system weigh less than 1,000th of a gram. That's 30,000 seeds per ounce. They get even much tinier than that. And so that's tiny, and it has biological, ecological implications. 5% establishment is a pretty good rate of establishment in prairie plantings around here. Less than 1% is quite common. And these seeds are not cheap, they're expensive. And so when you're faced with limited resources, you're going to scrimp on the expensive seeds. And so if you don't plant enough of them, you're just not going to see them at all. And that means that pollinators are not going to have access to those resources. So they require light to germinate. They're designed to be left on the surface of the soil and then work their way in a little bit through frost heave. They're vulnerable to washing, to just erosive washing away, and also to having sediment bury them. And either way, you've lost that seed. They are subject to fungal and bacterial infection, to ants, crickets, earthworms, mice, and birds. After all, they're yummy. They're great little packets of fat and protein, and they are preyed upon. There's a lot of ways for them to die, and they lose viability just by aging out. So, and that a lot of that applies to the seedlings as well. They're also tiny. They grow slowly above ground, and they're vulnerable again to washing, burial, desiccation, just drying out, drowning, as well as attacks by fungi and small mammals. Voles love seedlings. So in response to that, what have we got to work with? It's pretty blunt instruments. We have broadcast seeding and we have native seed drills, and not a lot else. You can scatter it on the surface, you can drop it on the surface, or you can put it into a shallow groove in the surface. There's a lot of variation with plant leaf litter and soil disturbance to think about that, but basically you've got, this is what we've got. And even that shallow burial with the native seed drill that's designed to plant seeds, we had a question, which was, is it a good thing to use a native seed drill when you have a lot of tiny seeds in the seed mix? And so Justin designed this experiment with a deliberately tiny seed mix. 90% of the seeds in the mix were less than 1,000th of a gram, and then half of the plots were seeded with a drill, and the other half were drop seeded on the surface, also with the drill, but they just no groove to land in. And the upshot is, and it's a small experiment, limited replication, but the tiny seeds really benefited from surface seeding. Some of them were 12 times more abundant when they were surface seeded than drilled, 12 times. Others just 80% more, which is still a lot. And so those results suggest that when you have a seed mix that has a lot of pollinator plants in it, a lot of forbs, that surface seeding is the way to go if you can do other things to mitigate the risks of blowing away, washing away, or other things that can happen when soil is bare. So you have to think about those two things together. There are a couple of larger seeded species that needed burial or weren't found unless they were in the drilled site. So, that deserves a further look. But we're looking at a diverse set of seeds here, and the ones that are producing flowers tend to be the little ones. So a second implication that we always have a lot of questions about this is, can we overseed into an existing stand, whether that is something you don't like brome or other pasture grasses, or whether it is prairie that maybe you planted a while back and now you'd like to add more forb diversity to it. So we have two experiments that address this. This was an experiment that started this last spring in a grass waterway at Irvine Prairie, and it involved replications of 3 treatments, 0, 1, and 2 applications of glyphosate on the grass waterway to kill the existing stand before overseeding with a mixture of diverse prairie mixture. So the rest of that Irvine Prairie was cropped, but these grass waterways we were going to have to spray out in order to plant. And of course, we're not big herbicide fans at all, but we want to get those plants established. And so 0, 1, and 2 applications of glyphosate before overseeding. And the results were not surprising, but they were very clear. And that is the number of native stems per meter squared was very close to 0 in the no herbicide treatment, and was 5 per meter squared in the one application, and over around 17 per meter squared in the other. And have to remember that that's not the only stems that are there. The native stems are still occupying in that they're taking up the rest of the space, and this is only the first year of the study. And so what happens the following year and the year after that is likely that unless the native plants really get a good foothold, it will be non-native plants. It'll be the brome and pasture grasses that were there to begin with. These seedlings are tiny. They can't compete with existing vegetation. Even when you mow it short or burn it off, it's still down there underground, ready to just take over the world. And we just can't emphasize enough. It's just not, you're taking a knife to a gunfight. Baby seedlings, at least most of those that we work with, are not good at competing with existing established vegetation. There was a second study that Justin did as well on enhancing non-native cool season grass stands in roadside ditches, and with very similar results. If you have a lot of money and a lot of time, you can keep overseeding and overseeding and overseeding, but it will take a lot of time and money. So we also see plantings that unfortunately don't make it. Now, this was an urban planting in Cedar Falls. There were several of them in town that were done a couple of years ago, and they failed. And it's hard to tell after the fact what may have happened. We weren't involved in the plantings, but we greatly suspect that it was that the herbicide treatment on the existing turf grass, this is an old golf course, were not sufficient to kill the original vegetation, and that there was too much competition with the seedlings, and they didn't make it. So we don't want to see this. We want to see these things succeed, and it's a bit of humility is always required because a lot of things that can happen that are out of your control. Finally, native seeds have a good diverse seed mixture for this very highly resilient and diverse plant community that we want to achieve. That means that those native seeds have a wide diversity of requirements, and yet for germination and establishment. And yet we treat them like corn. We plant them all together all at once in the same seed bed. And so how do we achieve this if they all have different needs? And that a vast majority of them are, of course, going to die. So this is a different part of that same experiment that was only conducted at the one site next to the TPC. We still use the 3 seed mixes. Half was mowed and half was not mowed the first year, but we did that twice. We did it once, did a planting in mid-November of 2018, and then we did another planting of the same exact experiment in the spring of 2019. And so we were comparing different planting times. And this is related to, I'll just go back a slide. This is related to dormancy requirements. Grasses and some other species of forbs will germinate when they get the moisture and the soil temperature to germinate. Other seeds will hold back, other species will hold back, and they won't germinate even though conditions appear to be right, because they require a specific trigger. They require cold, moist period of strats called stratification to tell them, aha, winter has come and gone, and now it's safe to germinate. They don't know that, they don't know that they've been sitting in a bag in cold storage all winter. They need to experience cold, moist period of 30 days, 60 days, sometimes 90 days, or even 120 days before all the signaling happens so that they will germinate. So that means that things that are planted in the spring in a perfectly beautiful seed bed will sit there and most likely rot and not make it. Or they'll come up the following year, but then they're surrounded by bigger, older plants that can kick their butt. So this experiment was set to test fall versus spring planting, and it's been done before. This is not a new idea, but what is new is that it's also crossed with these different seed mixes that differ in the ratio of grasses to forbs. And don't worry, I won't give you a flurry of data slides here, just this one. And this is looking at the economy or the grass mix on the left, and then the diversity mix, half grass, half forbs in the middle, and then the pollinator palooza mix on the right. And this is the species richness in the plots. So just the total number of species that came up in these plots. And the triangles were planted in the dormant season in November, and the circles were planted in the spring. And you'll see for the grass mix, the economy mix, it doesn't matter when you plant it. You're going to get about 15, 16 species that are in there. But for the diversity mix and the pollinator mix that have so many of those forb species in there, the triangles, the dormant season plantings, had way more species diversity, 35 species in that diversity mix that was planted in the dormant season versus 25 that were planted in the spring. So this was sort of an interesting outcome. It really matters if you're going to ask, well, which is better, spring or fall planting? Well, it depends on your seed mix. And interestingly, most of the on-farm conservation plantings, the CRP plantings that we have surveyed, were done in the spring. And so here's an easy, relatively simple fix. It doesn't cost anything. Just plant in the spring instead of planting in the fall, plant in the fall in the dormant season after the soils are cold, so they don't germinate too soon. That can already beef up the success of your planting with no additional expense. And that's the kind of result that a practitioner can act on, tomorrow. digging down a little bit more into that same experiment, there were winners and losers depending on when you planted. The plantings in May and June favored warm season grasses and late summer blooming flowers. You know, your goldenrods, your asters. but planting in the dormant season favored cool season grasses, sedges, and spring blooming wildflowers. Summer blooming wildflowers didn't care. They would germinate either way. So you get different sort of functional groups that are being favored by different growing seasons or different planting times. So what do? You know, we want all of these. It's not like we only want the spring blooming wildflowers. We want all of these. And so an implication is that, you know, we may have to beef up the seed mix, increase the number of seeds per square foot of the disadvantaged groups by, you know, in the dormant season, you may have to plant a little higher density of the warm season grasses and late summer flowers in order to have enough of those. But, you know, we'll never be able to treat each species according to its optimum needs. There's just, I don't know how we would, but at least we have, we can think about what the majority of the species in our mix need and maybe adjust seeding rates appropriately. So back to the experiment real quick. We are fortunate with this Irvine Prairie situation where we're planting almost 300 acres over a period of 12 years. That we can test these things out. Now, this is an N of 1. This is not a replicated experiment, but once we got the results of these early results of these experiments, we had been planting each year in the spring, and in the fall of 2021, we decided to plant a section of about 7 acres in the dormant season in mid-November instead of in the spring. And then in the spring, we continued to plant with our normal planting time. And we got fewer seedlings coming up in that fall planting overall, but we got a brand new class of seedlings showing up right away, namely the spring forbs, that gray, that beige color in the bar on the far right, the fall bars there. And we got more of the cool season grasses in that mix as well. So yeah, N of 1, you know, could turn out different next year for sure. You know, you have to stay humble here, but it was an apparent confirmation or support for the experimental results on a little larger scale that a dormant season planting has some advantages. And this was also broadcast for the first time instead of drill seeded, again, because of our experimental results. So it's nice to see that. And there's Justin with his GPS unit on his hat, and he can tell on his phone exactly where he is at any point out there. And then all of this is mapped. So we're monitoring intensively with the hope that what we're able to do out there and learn from, we'll be able to continue to share with others. So, you know, just in terms of seed mix design, these grass forb balanced seed mixes that are half and half, both have more of these functional features that we like to see. And they also benefit from dormant seeding and benefit from surface seeding, as well as the pollinator mixes. So planning a diverse, resilient plant community, you know, it's easy for me as a plant ecologist to say, put seeds and seedlings first, organize your entire world around what those little baby vulnerable seeds and seedlings need. However, we also work with farmers and landowners and NRCS offices, and we know that that's hard to do. It's very hard to do. And the work that Andy Olson has been doing has really illustrated that. We have a series of case studies of seed mix design, of prairie strips that have been established by farmers in our area. This is the Randy Lou's farm. There's also the Rodman farm. We're looking at seed costs. We're looking at their timeline, some of the decisions they had to make. And it's a complicated thing. And so I think a lot of the work that's going on in these larger scale activities, you know, by nature, it has to deal with all of the steps, all the decisions, the equipment and contractors will line up, and it's a lot. And sometimes you're not always able to serve those baby seedlings as you'd like to because of all these other logistics that you have to deal with. And so I think that's where a lot of our progress is going to lie, in getting those logistics to better serve those seedlings. But we do know that farmer and landowner motivation, understanding of the benefits of prairie is not enough. It takes a lot more than that to be successful. A lot of different partnerships involved in working on farms, some of them here. And I'll just finish with a couple of quotes from farmers. Molly Aronowitz, who's a professional farm manager, the company, People's Company, manages with the farm operators on behalf of the landowners, manages over 100,000 acres in our area. The whole key to farming in Iowa is to be able to consistently do the same practice over 2,000 acres in the couple of days Mother Nature gives you the field conditions you need. Managing that risk is huge, and prairie strips, putting these strips within the field, is something one can control. You do it, it's there. You don't have to ongoing seasonal risk as you do with cover crops. And that is the world that farmers are living in. That's the world that they're living in which we'd like to have more prairie and better prairie as a conservation reserve program practice, more pollinator habitat out there in the landscape, in a place where there's no other way to get that habitat in our region. And then finally, her father, Randy Lewis, who's a farmer, you'll have trees. You know, trees will come up in these strips, and then they have to be managed. And that is the reality of that particular practice, but, you know, it's doable. So a lot of partners and funders to acknowledge here. But I think it's time for discussion. So I look forward to hearing what you are thinking.
Great talk, Laura. Thank you so much. Yes, I've got a few questions here, and
let me grab Justin and Andy here.
Okay. So for the folks that are listening in, I've been working with Laura and Kristen from the Tallgrass Prairie Center in Minnesota to help us in Minnesota to get a roadside program going. And I see that there's a question from Nebraska, and they'd like advice on getting acceptance for such a program. And I know Christine has a lot of great social surveys online.
Yeah, well, you know, the surveys that she's done with this is Christine Nemec. She's the manager of the Iowa Roadside Management Program here. And she did surveys with the decision makers, who tend to be the county board of supervisors. The program is required for the state, but it's at the choice of the county. So we're in the business of showing counties the benefits and helping them get started if they show an interest. And those county board of supervisors, especially the chair of that board, they don't mention pollinators at all. Pollinators are at the bottom of their list. They're interested in whether the public has support for it. If they sense that there's public support, they will, that is a strong indicator that they're going to look at it more, look at it with more of an open mind. So, you know, showing that appreciation for it and showing up is the way forward there, I think. And you know, you can mention the pollinators, but it's also about practicality for the roadside managers and the roadside managers that are familiar with this. You know, there's a learning curve, but it is not it's not a terrible learning curve, and there's a great culture here of learning from one another, especially through these conferences. So
great.
If that
Yeah,
helps.
and
Yeah.
I'll put that link to the paper in the chat for that person too, so they can see the whole study.
Yeah.
So Tyler has a comment and a question. Interesting to denote the different functions of the ecosystem between different ratios of grass to forb. One function you don't list in the graphic is deterring invasive species infiltration. Is this something you measured? Even though grass-dominated landscapes may have more cover, I would think a balanced grass forb landscape would occupy more niches that could otherwise be utilized by infiltrating invasive. Is this the case?
Yeah, yeah, this is a great question. Justin, do you want to address that?
Sure, yeah. So this is something that we talked about in one of our recent papers, and both of our papers that address that. One of the main experiments that we talked about today, looking at the influence of the balanced grass forb seed mix. It was producing roughly the same amount of weed resistance as the grass dominated mix. So they're basically equivalent. So yeah, you basically get the same weed resistance from a grass dominated mix, and you get similar amounts of pollinator resources. So it's kind of doesn't optimize either one, but it's sort of you get most of the benefits of both.
Yeah. Does that help?
Great. Yes, that's great. So I'm going to kind of combine some questions here. They're asking on success of seeding over just burned area, over in snow, and also did you use a bulking agent in your cedar?
Always use a bulking agent in the cedar. Rice hulls is the preferred thing, although we've used other things. And let's see, what was the other question?
Snow seeding and seeding over burns.
Yeah, yeah. Well, burned vegetation is not really suppressed vegetation, right? It's that those plants are still underneath the ground, ready to pop up like toast. So I'm not aware of any good research on overseeding into burn. We have a little bit, but it's not replicated. And yeah.
Study.
Right. Okay. So what we have done is burn and overseed into a grass dominated stand. This is an experiment I did, a graduate student of mine did 20 years ago now. And then some plots were left alone, some plots were mowed every week, with lawnmower mowing, every week for the whole summer. And we got good establishment of those forbs into the grass dominated stand from that repeated mowing. Now that when you and in the unmowed areas, we got nothing really. It just didn't come up. Very expensive. I mean, it's very, very unsuccessful. And so suppressing that existing vegetation by mowing it that worked, and it didn't kill it. It suppressed it. But most people on a larger scale can't afford to mow their whole CRP field every week for a summer. That would take them all week just to do that. So it has limited applicability, unfortunately.
Have you had any success with repeated mechanical disturbance or tillage for establishment?
We haven't really done much mechanical tillage. Mainly we're working in former soybean or former corn ground, and we're seeding right into that. We did do a little bit with that on the planting into corn here, didn't we? A little bit of light disking or harrowing before planting into the corn stubble, just kind of break up those stalks a little bit. But more soil disturbance means stimulation of even more annual weeds. So there's little point in doing that. And the seeds are so tiny, they're going to fall into little cracks and crevices and holes anyway, even without breaking up the soil. Andy, do you have any more thoughts on that?
No, not really.
Okay.
Okay, well, in the perfect scenario, what would the land look like before you started working on it? And what tactic or tactics would you use?
Well, there would be a remnant prairie right next to it. And we would start by burning that prairie and then harvesting the heck out of it, but sustainably over several years, maybe increasing that seed in our own seed production plots, and then planting into very weed-free environment like after soybeans or after corn. I don't know, what else could we add that would be good?
Yeah.
Lots of birds moving things over. It should be downhill from the remnants, so it's receiving seed from seed rain, downwind. I mean, the best restoration is natural succession and natural recolonization. But unfortunately, our landscape has lost that ability. And so, there's very few species that come in from the road ditch on their own, and we celebrate those that do. But in our world, everything has to be. We have to buy a lot of seed. Yeah, and then the rain needs to fall, right? There needs to be good moisture, and we're here in eastern Iowa where it's only infrequently do we have super dry years, and even that is relative. So I don't know, we had a dry year in 2021 or 22.
20 and 21 are pretty dry.
Yeah, and establishment was
Not so great, but it wasn't a failure.
yeah. So we're in a pretty resilient environment. I think the further west you go with more infrequent or rainfall, it's another story.
Well, we sure appreciate the work you do in Tallgrass, and the work you do in Iowa is certainly a model for the entire country. So thank you so much for presenting today.